Hello, and thank you so much for tuning in for this video. This video is all about vellum. It's one of my favorite card making elements. I'll have 3 cards today using some different vellum techniques. I've linked to this vellum that I'm using in the video down below in the description. So for all of my cards today, I'm using this Altenew Hello and Hug Stampin' Die set. I love a Stampin' Die set that includes a die and a shadow die that coordinate with a large greeting. I'm using another product from Altenew. This is the Garden Trellis Cover Die and the Waffle Flower A2 Layers dies. For the first card, I'm going to create some vellum flowers, and I have a combination of spray stains and mica stains here. I'm going to start with the leaves, and I have a piece of vellum in my spray box. I'm going to start with Distressed Spray Stain in Forest Moss, and I'll just give this a light coating and then a little bit of water. One of the tricky things about working with vellum is that it does tend to curl when it gets wet, but you can see here as I'm drying with my heat tool, it starts to unfurl a little bit. I'm able to dry it enough with the heat tool that the ink doesn't transfer. So once that's dry, I'm going to go back with this Distress Mica stain. This is in Wicked Elixir. And I will again spray just a little bit of water. I'll hit that with my heat tool, make sure that that is dry. And then the last layer is just a little bit of Distress Spray Stain in Black Soot. I wanted just a little bit of an accent there to give the look of maybe some mottled spaces on the leaves. For my flower panel, I'm starting out with a Distress Spray Stain. This is Picked Raspberry, and I'll hit that with a little bit of water and then the heat tool. And I'm coming back in for my second layer with a Distress Mica stain. This is Fortune Teller. So I'm using the same process as I did for the vellum panel for the leaves. My third layer, once this is dry, will be just a little bit of Black Soot. Again, just a little bit of an accent. I'm barely adding any here on this flower panel. While these panels are drying, I'll work on a background panel. I have an A2 size piece of vellum here, and I have this Garden Trellis Cover Die. This is a really intricate die, so I'm going to tape these together very securely on 3 sides so that vellum doesn't shift around while I'm die cutting. I'm going with a very clean purple and black theme for this card, so I decided to heat emboss the greeting with a shiny black embossing powder. I'm using just a scrap of white cardstock, and I'll stamp the large Hello greeting from the Altenew Hello and Hugs die set. I am going to use Versamark embossing ink and a midnight black embossing powder. There are several ways you can do this. I sometimes like to stamp in a very dark black ink like VersaFine Clair in Nocturne, and then go in for a second stamping with clear embossing powder. Just be sure to leave your stamp in your stamp positioning tool for that second stamping. But either way, each method produces a really nice result. Once I apply the embossing powder, I can go over this with my heat tool to set this powder. I'm going to use the provided die for this Hello greeting, and I'm also going to cut a separate shadow layer out of vellum. So I'll use that shadow layer die. It's nice to have that separate layer to sort of break up all of the white on the front of the card and provide a nice transition area between the lattice and that greeting. I have one more piece of stamping and die cutting here for this card. I have just a scrap piece of cardstock here, and I pulled out the Awesome Friend sentiment from the Hello and Hugs Stampin' Die set. I'm going to stamp this in my MISTI using the same process that I did for the greeting. So I will ink this up with Versamark embossing ink. I will use the Midnight Black embossing powder to emboss this. And once this is ready, I'll hit this with the heat tool. I did create 2. I created one on vellum and another one on white cardstock. And I'm just using this Gina K sentiment strip pack to choose a sentiment strip die that is a good fit. So I'll tape these down and again run this through the die cut machine. And once I have the card together, I'll decide which one of these 2 sentiment strips I want to use. I do that quite a bit with cards. So now I'm going to my Waffle Flower A2 Layers dies, and I'm going to create some white frames for my card. So I will use the second and third largest dies from this set to create a thicker frame and a thinner frame for the front of my card. I'll cut 2 sets of these frames. I'm going to use the second set for another card that's coming up in a bit. So I wanted to create a little more visual interest on this trellis piece and also break up a little bit of the different white elements that I have on the front of the card. So I am going to apply some embossing ink in just a few areas on this trellis. I don't want to cover the entire piece. And I'm going to apply some Wow White Pearl Superfine Embossing Powder just in the areas where I've applied that ink, and I will heat that up, and it just really helps to break up all of the different areas of white and create a little more interest. When designing a card, it's important to create a layout and to use elements that will draw the viewer's eyes all around the front of the card. The triangle layout is an example of this concept. I have some more information about the triangle concept and other design concepts up on my blog right now. My vellum pieces are dry, so I'm going to start some die cutting. I have just an assortment of different layered flower dies here with some leaves and stems that I've pulled in from a couple of different sets. So I will tape down this vellum piece to my die cut plate, and then I'm going to arrange these leaves and stems on this piece of vellum just in areas that I think just look nice and will make nice die cuts. I'll do the same thing with the flower vellum piece. On this piece, I do have some nice light and dark areas, so I can get some really great layering for these flowers. Okay, I have everything I need to start assembling this card. This is going to be an A2 size card. So I have just this plain white A2 size panel, and I am going to start by gluing one of these, the larger of the 2 frames that I cut, to the front of this vellum. I'm going to start with this part of the assembly of the card because it does take just a few minutes longer for vellum to adhere to whatever you're trying to glue it to. So I'm going to adhere this with some liquid adhesive, and then I'll put a couple of stamp blocks on it just for a few minutes to give it some time to dry. Next, I'll move on to the assembly of these different layers of the flowers. And this is very quick and easy, so I'm just matching up a smaller layer with a larger layer on each of the 3 flowers. And I'm using a couple of sets of reverse tweezers to just hold everything in place while it dries. Sometimes for the greeting, I like to die cut several layers of the large greeting. In this instance, I already have 2 layers. I have this front embossed layer and then that shadow layer that I cut from vellum, and that really is enough, I think, to give it some dimension. So you might have noticed that I am not assembling any of this onto that A2 card panel that I have up above. The reason why I am doing that is because I want that trellis layer to be free floating. And just that little bit of space between that trellis layer and that back panel will create enough space to provide some shadow and give just a little bit more depth and dimension to the front of this card. Okay, I'm ready to adhere this panel to this front panel on the card. So I'm only going to apply adhesive around the perimeter of this panel. And I'm ready to start creating a layout for my flowers, stems, and leaves. And this really, I think, is one of the most fun parts of card making. There are so many different things you can do, and sometimes you have an idea for a card in your head, and it isn't until you really have all of the elements and you start putting that card together that you realize whether or not what was in your head is going to translate onto paper and glue and ink. So many times when I'm creating a card like this, I make multiple versions of the card, and each time I feel like the card gets a little bit better. It's either the layout is a little bit better or my color scheme is a little bit better. and that I think is really the fun part of card making. So I pulled some little black embellishments out of my stash, and I am using these to create a little center here for each of my layered flowers. I'm using liquid adhesive to adhere my greeting and my sentiment. I did end up going with the cardstock sentiment, not the vellum one, and I can just save that in my stash for a future card. This is all going on an A2 white card base. I've already scored this at 4 1/4, so just need to give this a quick press, and I am going to use liquid adhesive to adhere this panel to the front of my A2 card base. I did add a couple of little raindrop embellishments down there under the sentiment later on, but this card is finished. I really love the 3D effect of those flowers. For the second card, I'm using the Altenew Hello and Hugs stamp and die set again, and I'm also pulling in this Altenew Flower Garden stamp and die set. This is a really nice set, lots of different stamps and coordinating dies. I'm going to be creating my flowers again with some vellum panels, and I also am putting everything on an A2 card base. So I have my A2 card base prepped and scored. For the flowers, I am going to start by stamping and embossing. Again, I'm using that Wow White Pearl Superfine Embossing Powder. I'll be using a couple of Copic markers to color my flowers. I'm using R83, R85, and G21. So I'll start by placing my vellum sheet in my MISTI and choosing a couple of flower stamps here that have a really nice drapey effect. So I'll arrange these stamps on the vellum panel in my MISTI and pick those up. And I am using Versamark ink to stamp these, and I do want to use my anti-static powder tool here because I don't want that embossing powder to get anywhere on these flowers other than just the outline stamp of the flower. So these look really nice. I'm going to hit this with the heat tool, and the Copic colors that I'm using are very, very light. I intentionally chose very light colors so that it would have a very soft feel and soft effect on the front of the card. So I'm going to start with my lightest color. This is the R83, and I'm just going over, I'm doing this on the back of the vellum, but I'm going over all of the petals. I'm staying within the lines that I have stamped and I've heat embossed. So I'm going over those parts that are the petals of the flowers and the buds of the flowers. So I'll go over everything with this R83, and then I'll go back over everything with the R85, just strategically here down into the center of those petals, the very bottom of each of those buds, just to give it a little bit of accent, a little bit of contrast. And you can see when I turn it over to the front just how light and soft all of those colors are. So last I'm going in with the G21, the green, and I'm filling in all of the leaves and the stems. For the green, I decided not to use a darker accent color for the leaves. I felt like it made it just a little bit darker than the look that I was going for. So I'm going back in with that R85 again and just darkening a couple of those little spots in the center of the flowers. I really love the very soft look of this Copic on vellum. I think it's a beautiful look, especially with that heat embossed outline. So I'm just going to tape down the coordinating dies for each of these flowers and die cut these. I really think this is, of all of the flowers that I did for these cards, these are just almost magical. They're so pretty. Okay, so I'm pulling out that garden trellis cover die again, and instead of die cutting this time, I am going to emboss. So I'm taping this cover die to an A2 piece of white cardstock, and I am going to create a sandwich for my Platinum 6. So my sandwich is the platform, my cover die with the paper tape to it, the flexible mat, and then the embossing plate goes on the top. It creates a really nice impression on the panel. So now I'm going to create a sentiment strip, and I wanted a coordinating color for my sentiment strip with a color that I had already used in the flowers of my card. So I'm taking that R85 Copic marker, and I'm just creating a small piece of colored cardstock that I can use to stamp my sentiment. Once this is dry, I can place this in my MISTI, and I'm going to pull out one of those sentiment strips from my Hello and Hugs stamp set. I'm using the sentiment Thinking of You, My Friend, and I can line that up in the area that I colored in with the Copic marker and pick that up with my MISTI. I'm going to stamp that with Versamark ink, and I'm going to heat emboss with a superfine white embossing powder. I think that the superfine embossing powder works really, really well for these very small sentiment strips. The result that you get is very clean, it's very crisp. This embossing powder that I'm using is a Wow superfine white embossing powder. So I'm going back to my Gina K Sentiment Strips dies. These are very versatile. I use them quite a bit. And I am just going to line this up. I chose a die that fits my sentiment really well. And I'm also going to cut a second one just out of white to layer that sentiment and give it a little bit of dimension. So I am ready to assemble this card. I have all of the elements. I have another white A2 card base that I have scored at 4 1/4. And just like I did in the previous card, I am going to stack these two frames, this narrow frame and the little bit wider frame. And then I'm ready to start arranging my Copic colored and die cut flower pieces. So I kind of like this drapey arrangement here. And because it is vellum, I don't want to use a liquid adhesive on the back. And I've found that this double-sided tape works really, really well. You can't really see it on the other side if you use small pieces and you place them strategically. So I'm trying to place my tape pieces where some of the darker Copic coloring is, or where the two pieces overlap, so that you can't see any of that adhesive through the front of those flower pieces. I also like the fact that using very little tape here on these flowers allows some of the edges of the flowers to just sort of sit on top of the paper, and it gives it a little bit more dimension. For this card, I'm going with just a simple sentiment strip, not a greeting. So I will adhere these two layers of the sentiment strip together with just some liquid adhesive, and then I will use a small strip of foam tape to attach this sentiment to the front of the card. I really like the simple look on the front of the card with just a sentiment strip. So this panel will be adhered to an A2 card base. I went with a top fold this time, a landscape top fold card, and I needed a little something else on the front, so I pulled out a couple of water drop embellishments, and I'm doing just a little triangle shape, 3 little water drop embellishments on the front to finish off this card. In case you didn't notice, I have sort of a friendship theme going here with these cards. I feel like you can't have too many friendship cards. For the third card, I'm using this Simon Says Stamp Friendship Text Background Stamp. It's a really nice 6x6 stamp, and I've used this for a couple of cards that I've done here recently. Also pulling out again this Altenew Hello and Hugs stamp and die set, and I am going to stamp 2 of these friendship text background panels on vellum. So I have just attached a little bit of double-sided tape to the back of one of my vellum panels, and I've stuck that down inside my MISTI. I've removed that that foam piece that's inside the MISTI because this background stamp is a thick red rubber background stamp. I'm going to ink this up with Versamark, and I'll use my anti-static powder tool to make sure that I don't have any embossing powder anywhere where I don't want it on this text stamp. So I'm going to again emboss this with the Wow White Pearl Superfine Embossing Powder. and I will heat up both of these panels, and I have 2 panels ready to go for the next 2 cards. I did have to edit out this card for the sake of time, but the details are up on my blog. So for this next card, I'm using the Hero Arts Butterflies Infinity die set, and I'll pull in one of these vellum panels that I just prepared with the friendship text background stamp. I am going to do a Distress Oxide ink blending technique here on this A2 panel. I'm using Tattered Rose, Scattered Straw, and Evergreen Bough inks. I've sort of visually divided my panel into 3 sections, and I'm going to start with the Tattered Rose, and I'll apply this ink a little bit darker here along the edge and then lighter as I move to the edge of that first 1/3 where I'm going to just apply this color. Applying darker to lighter helps with the transition area in between the 2 colors. I've sped up my ink blending here quite a bit, but I'm really just following this process, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 for each color. And then once I've applied each of these 3 colors for 1 layer, I'm going back over that transition area between the 2 colors with the lightest color and just trying to blend that out so I have a really seamless, nice transition between each of the colors. So here's my finished background. I kept everything very light on the layers and the depth of my color. I'm going to pull out a couple of these Butterfly Infinity dies, and I'm lining those up on that heat embossed vellum panel that I created just a bit ago. And I'm being careful to line these up so that I can read the text that I've embossed there. So I will tape these down and run them through my die cut machine. And then I just want to give each of these butterflies a little bit of a fold right down the center of each of the butterflies. So again, to adhere these to each other to create a 2-layered butterfly and also to adhere it to the front of this ink blended panel, I am going to use some double-sided tape. It works really well to not show that adhesive, especially through this vellum die cut that doesn't have the safety of any coloring to keep that adhesive from showing through on the front. I've placed the double-sided tape only along that fold area on each of these butterflies, so that helps as well with the adhesive not showing through. If you place the adhesive only along the fold, it allows the wings to sort of sit free on top of the paper. For the antennae, I'm just attaching those to the exposed adhesive on the back of the larger butterfly, and it's ready to adhere to the card. For this card, I'm using the Hello, Greeting, and Shadow die, and I'm using the You Are Amazing sentiment strip. So I'm going to heat emboss that large greeting, and I will stamp this on just a scrap of white cardstock. I am inking that up with Versamark embossing ink, and I will heat emboss that with that same Midnight Black embossing powder. I'm using that greeting die from the set to cut out my greeting, and I am going to stamp the sentiment on just a scrap of white cardstock, and I am using VersaFine Clair ink in Nocturne. Generally it only takes 1 stamping. I do still have a pretty nice new juicy stamp here. Pulling out that Gina K sentiment strips die set again to die cut this little sentiment strip. And now everything is ready to adhere, and I can start assembly of the card. I'm going to start by just applying some liquid adhesive to the back of my large greeting die cut, and I can adhere those 2 layers together. And then for the sentiment strip, I cut a second piece that was the same size as my sentiment strip, and I can create layers from that. I have an A2 white card base here. I'll just give it a fold and a press. For the ink blended panel, I want to trim this down a little bit, so just a tiny bit of my white card base is showing behind this panel. Normally I would measure this, or I would pull out maybe one of the Gina K Master Layouts dies to cut that down. I just kind of eyeballed it this time and lined it up on the front of my card. So now I can start with some layout on the front of this card. I always think about what I want the focal point to be. When the recipient opens the card, what do I want them to see first? And on this card, I really love these layered friendship text butterflies. So I want those to be front and center. So I'm putting those on first. I want them smack dab in the middle of the front of this card. And then I will place my greeting and my sentiment strip along the top and the bottom of those layered butterflies. So I have those in place. I've added 3 little water droplet embellishments there on the front to sort of round out my design. And I'm using some 1/2-inch foam tape to adhere this front panel to my A2 card base. This is a side fold A2 card. Here's my Kathy Zilski little tip here again, just adding a little bit of liquid adhesive to the foam tape. Gives you just a few seconds of wiggle room there before that foam tape really adheres that. So if you don't get it exactly lined up the first time, it gives you just a little bit of time to pull that off without damaging either your panel or your card base. So here's the finished card as well as the other cards from the video. The hugs card on the left is up on my blog. I apologize that that had to be deleted. The video was just getting incredibly long, but you can pop over there for all the details. Also, I hope you're enjoying this content and that you'll consider subscribing to my channel. I love card making. I love creating new content that I can share with you. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.